Hi everyone, welcome to Tidy TV, where I bring the classroom to you. I'm Hannah John, and today I'm going to talk about how you can prepare the actual presentation for your academic conference. Stay tuned. So in my previous video, I looked at 5 tangible things that you could do prior to an academic conference to help you better prepare. I only touched briefly on the idea of the actual presentation itself, give a great presentation, but today I wanted to kind of expand on that a little bit more and talk about substance considerations as well as style. Now before I actually get into kind of the nitty-gritty details, I wanted to start off with some kind of foundational concepts for us as we prepare for the academic conference presentation. And the first is that we actually speak differently than how we write, and so what we don't want to do is to give kind of a copy and paste rendition of our written writing and essentially speak that verbatim in the academic conference. That doesn't pan out really well. You're going to lose the interest of your audience very quickly, and also we're not able to engage with the listeners or even with ourselves, I think. The second to remember, and I hope this is kind of calming and assuring for you, is that we as the listeners, we are on your side when it comes to you presenting at an academic conference. Oftentimes we do feel like as presenters at academic conferences that we're being judged and evaluated by what we prepare and how we present it. I mean, in some ways it might be true, but not in the way that you think. I don't think that there are very mean-spirited scholars or participants who come there waiting to see you mess up or wanting to kind of attack you on certain elements of your presentation, but really we're there out of academic curiosity to hear what you have to say about your research and hopefully to learn from you. So as you're preparing, try to think that the audience is on your side. Please don't be nervous, and hopefully this will give you a much more positive attitude as you're preparing. And the last thing, of course, is to think from the perspective of the viewer or the listener, and to try to think from what I would like to call the least common denominator. And the least common denominator, or actually kind of the average spectator, might be someone who's not an expert in your field. And so when you think about the average person who is listening and watching, please try to cater your presentation to the average person or the least common denominator. And at this point, I think it's safe to say a lot of your listeners might be very tired and exhausted from listening to many other presentations. So again, hopefully this might inform how you craft your own presentation for the academic conference. Okay, so the first major area that we can look at in preparing your presentation for the academic conference is substance. And by substance, I'm looking primarily at the contents of your presentation. Unless there are some specific kind of guidelines given by the conference organizers about what you should be including in your presentation, oftentimes we just like to follow a very kind of simple structure that would be quite similar actually to what you would have in a research paper. The one major difference, I think, is that actually you can include maybe a bit more personal motivation as to why you're conducting this research, what actually got you interested in this topic in the first place. And I think sometimes having that kind of personal connection at the beginning of your presentation before you actually introduce kind of the academic contributions might actually be helpful to connect you with the viewers and listeners. What I like to do is I often like to include my contact information or the contact information of all co-authors on the first page, the title page, as well as on the ending page. And so this might actually be a way for you to interact or get kind of maybe follow-up questions about your research from those spectators who might be a bit more passive than active. So I think in terms of the actual contents of the presentation, there aren't huge questions, but of course, as we move into stylistic considerations, this might be where you might have some issues or concerns about presenting your data. Now, from the perspective of someone who's presented at academic conferences, but also someone who's listened to a lot of presentations, some kind of stylistic considerations I'd like to suggest include things like the number of slides. Again, there's no golden rule here, but in terms of slides, my experience has been less is more. I tend to prepare maybe 1 or 2 slides per item. So if you have, motivation for conducting the research and contribution, followed by the research question, followed by literature review, followed by data and methods, and followed by preliminary findings, it tends to be roughly 1 or 2 slides per topic. And if you have, say, 10 or 15 minutes for the actual presentation, that would be more than enough in terms of filling the time for your presentation. And so to go above and beyond that for the main part of the presentation, I think you'll find that you're really pressed for time, and it might be, again, information overload for the average viewer or listener to your presentation. One thing, of course, you should be doing is, because you can't cover everything in the main presentation, is that you can anticipate some questions that that audience members might have about your presentation. In that case, what I like to do is I tend to have an appendix, maybe a much more involved and detailed appendix, especially with data, not just about kind of preliminary findings, but also when it comes to the methodology. If there are questions about that, then I can actually during the Q&A session point them to data in the appendix without having to fit everything in or try to fit everything in to the main presentation. In addition to having a minimal number of slides for the present, greater use of figures and illustrations or tables as opposed to a lot of text. And so yes, we're not going to be reading our paper to the audience. If that's the case, you don't actually need a presenter. You can just give them a copy of the most recent paper, but do make use of visual kind of illustrations of your data. A third stylistic consideration would be font size. And again, this might depend on the nature of the conference, if it's going to be offline or online. What I found with a lot of online conferences is because with Zoom, we can actually just see the entirety of the slides. And so you can get away with having much more data fit into one slide. But especially for those who are joining offline, if you try to think again from the perspective of the viewer and the least common denominator, someone who's maybe sitting in the back, a little bit tired, and looking at your presentation, if you try to fit so many things on a slide, whether it's text or even data, and it's very small, it makes it very difficult to engage with the research. And so here I would recommend using a larger font size as opposed to smaller. And even when it comes to color, I know that we're very tempted to make it beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, but oftentimes the best thing is to make sure that it's legible and that it's very clear and that we're able to follow along with the logic of the presentation without having to go through all of these kind of accoutrements and lovely designs. Another related stylistic consideration would also be transitions, and again from the least common denominator perspective and the tired spectator perspective, it might look nice when you're presenting or creating the presentation by yourself if you have very fancy transitions and a lot of animation, but from again the perspective of the viewer, oftentimes this might be a distraction or maybe even make some of the viewers dizzy. And so unless it's absolutely necessary for the presentation and kind of to make sure that it's going along smoothly, I would also try to keep transitions as smooth and as less involved as possible. And the last major section I wanted to cover today is to talk about stylistic considerations for your presentation when it comes to the actual kind of verbal delivery of your presentation materials. I think one of the biggest challenges in terms of the delivery is our level of nervousness increases when our level of preparedness decreases. And so from the flip side, the more prepared you are with regards to the substance of your presentation, I think the better you're able to get through the presentation itself. Make sure you know your presentation materials inside out. You are the expert in this area. At the same time, don't feel that you have to know everything. Again, these are oftentimes working papers or works in progress, and that means you might only have, say, preliminary findings. You're not completely done with your research. And that's part of the beauty of an academic conference, is that you can engage with other scholars so that they can also give you feedback about your research and improve it going forward. You should know exactly why you engaged in this research, how it fits within the academic literature, why you have chosen specific data and methods to answer this research question, and about the veracity of your results so far. So hopefully when it comes to stylistic considerations, when you're delivering verbally your message, you're able to speak with confidence, but also with a bit of open-mindedness, as of course these are preliminary findings. So one question that I get here is it better to have a written script or maybe just a list of bullet points that you'd like to cover during the presentation? I think I can see the pros and cons of both methods, but ultimately I think it really depends on you and which is most comfortable for you. I can definitely see the pros of script writing. You don't go off on tangents, and that you have a clear message, and that all you have to do is deliver this. But then of course, oftentimes if you have a script, it does sound scripted. So maybe there's a little bit less engagement or spontaneity or excitement that shows through with your presentation. And of course for bullet points, I think bullet points are often used for those who really know their materials. They don't need to have a script because they know it inside out, but at the same time, because you're so excited about your research, oftentimes it might lead you to go off script a little bit or off on a tangent, and you might end up going over in terms of time. But please choose a method that is most comfortable for you while sticking to the parameters of the conference. The last thing that I would highlight when it comes to stylistic considerations in the verbal delivery of your presentation is to be clear. And this has to do not just with pronunciation, but also, where you would like to emphasize key points within your presentation, and also in terms of the speed and the volume with which you're conveying your message. You should try to practice using a microphone, because oftentimes the podiums that we're presenting at have these microphones, and try to present in front of peers or friends, or maybe even with other presenters who might be going to this conference. If this will be offered online as well, oftentimes I do try to speak a bit slower, because there might be temporary buffering issues and they might miss a big chunk of the presentation if there's maybe less stable internet connection. And last but not least, please take a deep breath. Try to stay as calm as possible, and you'll do a great job, I'm sure. So I hope you're feeling a bit more prepared for your academic presentation, and I wish you all the best at this conference, whichever one it may be. So until next time here on Tari TV, bye!